We'll start this morning with some big breaking news.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued one of his starkest warnings yet on Monday, acknowledging that Israel is entering what he called a kind of isolation that could last for years as global anger intensifies over the nearly two-year war in Gaza. Speaking with visible defiance, Netanyahu insisted that Israel has no choice but to stand on its own, even as international protests, diplomatic ruptures, and calls for sanctions against his government mount at an unprecedented pace. The conflict, now approaching its second anniversary, has become one of the most divisive geopolitical issues of the 21st century. What began as a military campaign aimed at dismantling Hamas has grown into a grinding war that has reshaped international alliances, paralyzed peace initiatives, and sparked humanitarian catastrophe. The Gaza Strip remains under relentless bombardment, its population facing severe shortages of food, medicine, and clean water, while reconstruction is impossible amid the ongoing military campaign. Netanyahu's speech carried the tone of a leader steeling his nation for long-term estrangement from much of the international community. "We are facing a kind of isolation, and it may last for years," he said. "But Israel cannot compromise on its security or its right to exist. History shows us that when Israel defends itself, it often stands alone. This time will be no different." His words come at a moment when Israel's diplomatic ties are under intense strain. Over recent months, several Latin American nations including Chile, Colombia, and Bolivia have either downgraded or severed relations with Israel. In Europe, countries such as Spain, Ireland, and Norway have taken symbolic steps to recognize Palestinian statehood, moves that Netanyahu has fiercely condemned as rewarding terrorism. Even some of Israel's traditional allies have begun voicing sharper criticism. In Washington, the Biden administration continues to back Israel militarily but faces growing domestic dissent. Prominent Democratic lawmakers have called for conditioning aid, while mass protests in American cities demand an end to arms sales. At the United Nations, resolutions critical of Israel's actions in Gaza have drawn overwhelming support, leaving the United States and a handful of allies isolated in their vetoes or abstentions. For Netanyahu, however, the surge of international disapproval appears to have reinforced, rather than weakened, his determination to pursue the military campaign. He framed Israel's position as one of moral clarity against what he described as hypocrisy abroad. "There are those who lecture us while ignoring the atrocities committed against our people. We will not bow to international dictates that endanger our citizens," he declared. Critics argue that Netanyahu's hardline stance is both politically motivated and strategically short-sighted. Domestically, his coalition government remains fragile, propped up by far-right partners who demand uncompromising military action and outright rejection of Palestinian statehood. Facing corruption charges and widespread protests over his judicial reforms, Netanyahu has relied on wartime rhetoric to shore up his political standing. By portraying Israel as besieged not just by Hamas but also by hostile international opinion, he strengthens his nationalist appeal. Yet analysts warn that the costs of Israel's isolation could prove severe. Beyond diplomatic condemnations, the country faces the prospect of expanded boycotts, restricted arms sales, and challenges in international courts. Already, the International Criminal Court is reviewing allegations of war crimes, while human rights organizations intensify their calls for accountability. Economically, Israel risks losing trade opportunities, investment partnerships, and cultural ties that have long bolstered its global integration. At the heart of the crisis remains the humanitarian disaster unfolding in Gaza. Aid agencies describe conditions as catastrophic, with hundreds of thousands displaced, hospitals operating beyond capacity, and food insecurity reaching alarming levels. the United Nations has repeatedly warned of famine-like conditions, while images of destruction circulate daily on social media, fueling outrage and protest movements worldwide. For many international observers, these scenes have come to define Israel's actions, overwhelming its claims of military necessity. Still, Netanyahu has shown little willingness to alter course. His government maintains that Hamas bears ultimate responsibility for civilian suffering, accusing the group of using Gaza's population as human shields. Israeli officials argue that ending the war prematurely would leave Hamas intact, emboldening militants and jeopardizing Israel's long-term security. "We will continue until victory is secured," Netanyahu reiterated Monday, brushing aside calls for an immediate ceasefire. This entrenched position has left international mediators with few options. Ceasefire negotiations brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States have collapsed repeatedly, undermined by mutual mistrust and shifting conditions on the ground. While some diplomats suggest a prolonged truce could be achievable, others warn that both Israel and Hamas remain locked in a cycle of retaliation that defies outside pressure. The sense of stalemate has deepened public frustration across the globe. From London and Paris to Jakarta and Cape Town, mass protests have drawn hundreds of thousands demanding an end to the war. In university campuses, labor unions, and civic organizations, boycotts of Israeli products and institutions are expanding. Netanyahu's warning of prolonged isolation is, in many ways, already materializing. For Israel, the question now is how long it can sustain its course without significant shifts in international policy. Some analysts believe that as Western governments face mounting public pressure, even Washington's support could erode in the long term. Others argue that Netanyahu's strategy is designed precisely for such conditions, to entrench Israel's security doctrine in the belief that survival depends on self-reliance, regardless of global opinion. As the conflict grinds into its third year, the human toll in Gaza and the diplomatic costs for Israel continue to rise. Netanyahu's acknowledgement of isolation marks a pivotal moment, signaling that his government is bracing for a prolonged period of confrontation not just on the battlefield but also on the world stage. Whether Israel can withstand the pressures of war abroad and political turmoil at home remains uncertain. For now, Netanyahu's message is unyielding: Israel will stand alone if it must, convinced that security is worth the price of isolation. But with the war showing no signs of ending and global anger escalating, the path forward appears fraught with both moral and strategic peril.